I want to begin this morning by asking you, and you don't have to say this out loud, but let me ask, what is the one thing in your life that you couldn't live without? The one thing that if it disappeared right now, you'd be kind of lost. Now, I know you're behind me, but I expect you to think too. Okay? Now, don't say it, but just hold it. If you're like me, the book of Hebrews, from which our scripture came this morning, is not a bestseller. It's not in the top 10 of familiar passages or letters within the New Testament. As Guillermo said, it was originally credited to the Apostle Paul, but scholars have since ascribed it to someone anonymous, an anonymous participant in what I would call the Jesus movement. We like to think and believe there was this church at the time, but there were spotty churches. It was more of a movement gathering steam, a head of steam than anything else. And my own study leads me to believe that it was written towards a very, very specific audience. That it was written targeted at Greek-speaking Jews. Jews who were perhaps living in Alexandria, Egypt at the time. Why do I conclude this? Well, for a number of reasons. When in the 5th century BC, Alexander the Great conquered all that area around the Mediterranean and even as far as Afghanistan, during that period, Greek became the language of that part of the world. You know, they might have spoken other, more local in addition, but Greek was the language. If you were an educated, sophisticated, you were a business person, you were in an area where tourists came, anything else, you spoke Greek. And it was definitely so in Egypt. And Alexandria was where the largest library in the world was established. So, in 587 BC, when Jerusalem was destroyed and the Jews were deported and cast around the world, many of them ended up in Egypt, in Alexandria. Make sense? So whoever wrote this letter was writing to some people who knew the Jewish faith, knew the Jewish tradition, but also had the other part of themselves in the Greek world where they would know of Greek philosophy, the Greek gods, and how Greeks thought. You know, this kind of dichotomy of thinking. So when he writes, he can't use some of the other languages that are used in the New Testament where they assume they know the Jesus story and they know Jewish history and they know who Moses is or was, and they know all that stuff. You can't assume that. You have to kind of slip it in and insert it when appropriate because these people have a different background, different culture. In the Bible, sometimes they called them God-fearers. They weren't Jewish. They were familiar with all the Greek and other worldly religions, but they were intrigued by the monotheism of Judaism. And so you have this conglomerate of people, probably the core of which were of Jewish background, but many of which didn't have any of that in common. So you had to be, if you were a writer or a speaker or an author, you had to be a pretty sharp individual to get your message across, faithful to what you want to say, but in a language and a setting that can be very, very different. You know, the Jews in Alexandria were as different from the Jews in Jerusalem at this time as New Yorkers would be from residents of Chugwater, Wyoming. I have been to New York and I have been to Chugwater, so you're going to just really have to trust me on that one. Now, knowing this illuminates the text because we forget that people were very worldly or religious in that time in the world. Greeks were very religious. They had gods for everything. You had gods, patron gods of the cities. You had a hierarchy of gods for the world and the creation of the world. Families had their own gods for fertility or for good crops, whatever they did. And of course, they existed in this hierarchy, right? If you did any studying in school of Greek mythology, you know that Goose, I think that was in Top Gun, Zeus resided at the top, right? Zeus resided, and then all these other gods were below him. You had Apollo, you had Mercury, you had Aphrodite, as I said. You had all these other gods, and they would play tricks on each other. They were always trying to get higher on that scale of deities. They injected themselves in human culture as well. You know, people believed they were responsible for good crops, bad crops, tragedies, blessings, all kinds of things. These gods meddled with the weather. They carried on intimately with humans, and they even pitted humans against each other so that they could gain some kind of heavenly advantage. So whoever is trying to speak to them about Jesus would need to be familiar with both arenas, this Jewish Jesus and this Greek theology, in order to convey whatever they're trying to say. You following me? I mean, this is essential, I think, to understanding some of these texts. Let me give you an example. Once upon a time, I drove my car into a borrow pit. Ring a bell with anybody here? A borrow pit? Where I grew up, a borrow pit is just the ditch on the side of the road. Right? A colleague of mine who moved to Florida, Vero Beach specifically, from Minnesota, said to me, he said, I was at that church for 3 years before I realized that I was preaching to questions my people weren't asking. You follow me? So those are the things behind where this leads us. So whoever this book was written to had specific questions about Jesus. They wanted to know. And if you read the passages before and after the text we read this morning, they were really asking about angels. They had a big, what are these other things flying around, and what's Jesus' relation to them, and what then is Jesus' relationship to God? And what kind of authority does Jesus have over humans? This was the question behind this. They're trying to figure out this universe of deities. We might say, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, God here, us here, or in their thinking, Zeus here and some other god here, where should we rank in our day-to-day lives this Jesus? What priority should he have? It was a fair question. A fair question then and now. So let me go back to where I started. What is the one indispensable thing in your daily life? What is it? And don't try to patronize me because I'll catch you right away. What is it? What do you think you couldn't get through the day without? Oh, you could get through the day without your car. You just walk. What? Your what? God? Is that what you said? Yes. Yeah, maybe later. Let's go. What else? Your cell phone. Come on now. Come on now. For most people, their cell phone is the first thing they pick up and the last thing they lay down. Maybe I could have picked a better image, but that I couldn't live without my cell phone. I mean, I could, but what do we get on it? We get texts, we get notes, we get messages, we check our schedule, we get news, we get addresses, we get directions. How did we ever live without GPS in the past? We carry our phones everywhere. After all, we might have some downtime and we'll just jump right on there and play Candy Crush. Or what's the one with birds? Bad Day with Birds, or what is that? What? See, now you know what Guillermo does when he has downtime. Usually during my sermons, he's playing Angry Birds. Now, it might be a stretch to say that we worship these things, But we are willing as a population to pay and to make exorbitant sacrifice to possess them. But ask yourself now, what if in your life you drop their ranking in that 1 to 10 and picked up a true influencer, which the author of Hebrews, in a different time, in a different place, was suggesting to those people? What would change in your life? What would happen in the lives of our society? I can tell you, quite honestly, people's anxiety would decrease. Jealousy of others, what they do or what they say, by comparison with other people, would shrink. FOMO would get less. You know what FOMO is? Fear of missing out on something. You know, the direct correlation with teens and the advent of smartphones directly correlates with depression, anxiety, suicide. So I think those things might lessen, and our sense of self-esteem and purpose would probably rise. You know that most people who own a cell phone check their phone 63 times a day. Have you ever sat in a restaurant and watched people? Americans spend an average screen time of 5.5 hours on their mobile phones daily. Social media eats up 2 hours, 24 minutes of internet time daily. 13% of millennials spend over 12 hours a day. These are the people starting to run our country. But baby boomers, of which many of us are, 5 hours a day. Millennials spend 48 minutes a day texting. And of course, you know, if you own an Apple phone, an iPhone, you can check it. It'll tell you how much time you're on and where. But here's my point. This is where I want to go. The phone is just an illustration of a priority in our life, or things that are a thing that is important in our life, that occupies our thinking and our minds and our daily where we go, what we need to do. You know, we ask for volunteers. Volunteerism has declined across the country, and the primary response when somebody is asked to volunteer is they say, "I'm too busy." And this says, well, what are you too busy doing? You see? The phone is just one illustration, and Jesus says to us, where our treasure is, there also will be our heart. Because the fact, whether you lived in the ancient world in Alexandria or in the modern world today, who and what and who we see, watch, listen to, and then think about molds and shapes our existence. Which is why the Apostle Paul also said in the book of Philippians, remember that whatever things are true, noble, just, pure, lovely, whatever is good, virtuous, and praiseworthy, these are the things you need to think on. These are the things that must be a priority. Do you know what a phylactery is? Some of you may. You know what a phylactery is? It's not a portable outhouse, I want to assure you, it's not. A phylactery almost sounds like a medical tool, doesn't it? I could have probably done this better. Just kidding. A phylactery is, if you've ever been around Orthodox Jews, New York City or anywhere, Israel, you will see them with a black box on their forehead and a headband. Okay, they have a black box here. That's what pious Jews in Jesus' day wore. And in that box are 3 Hebrew letters: Shin, Daleth, and Yod. Shin, Daleth, and Yod. And when you take those 3 letters and bring them together, they form the divine name Shaddai. So what they are saying, what they're trying to witness to, is what leads their thinking, their work, their steps, their daily life is God. Now, I'd never wear one. You know, I'm too self-conscious, I guess. But they make a point. They make a point. And that point is, well, a point and a question. That point is, you know, that's a symbol of what they are saying leads them, guides them, which leads me to ask, what guides us? What goes before us, wherever our life takes us, what decisions we make, where we end up living, you know, what is it that we would put in that box? I wonder. And on a scale of 1 to 10, who would be at the top of your hierarchy of that ranking? Where would you place God? Where would you put Jesus? And is it possible that he could or should be ranked just a little higher? That's the whole question behind this text. 1 to 10. That's the life-changing thought that the author of the book of Hebrews asked those people then. What is your priority? And in that prioritizing, where do you put your faith? Where does Jesus come into play? What's his role? What does he offer? Where's God? And should God be ranked a bit higher than God is? Amen.